Thanks, Brendan, and thanks for the invitation to be here today. I enjoy coming to these talks from time to time, so it's great to have a chance to present. So before I start, I'd like to thank my collaborators, Chris Lucas, Pat Shafter, and Josh Tannenbaum. All of us already know that machine learning has lots of tools that are useful for solving real-world problems. My research is inspired in part by the idea that some of these tools are also useful for understanding how people think. So perhaps the most obvious example of this is work on neural networks. Great for solving difficult real-world problems, but there's also been a lot of work looking at deep networks with architectures and layers and units that are directly inspired by what's known, say, in this case, about the human visual recognition system. Today, I'm not going to talk about deep networks. I'm going to talk about graphical models and the extent to which some ideas from graphical models can tell us something about how people think. And just as an example that there's a long literature in this area as well, there's a book here by Clark Glimore at CMU. The title is The Mind's Arrows, Bayes Nets and Graphical Causal Models in Psychology, and many other psychologists have worked in this tradition as well. So here for me are the three main reasons why graphical models, or directed graphical models in particular, might be useful for understanding how people think. So number one, a lot of times people are facing problems where they have to reason under uncertainty, and we know that probabilistic inference is a useful strategy for dealing with these cases. Second, if you're dealing with directed graphical models, the fact that the arrows can be given a causal interpretation is a really good thing, because a lot of times humans seem to rely fundamentally upon causal kinds of ideas in reasoning. And the one here that I'm going to focus on today is the idea that Bayes nets give you a modular representation of knowledge, and that's useful because it helps to explain how different kinds of knowledge structures are combined. I think one of the biggest challenges for psychology and AI and machine learning is to explain how reasoning depends on rich systems of background knowledge, and to the extent that we have modular representations that can be composed and put together to build more expressive, richer kinds of knowledge systems, we're able to make progress towards understanding this aspect of common sense reasoning. So I'm going to talk about Bayes nets applied to human reasoning, and I'm going to focus on two particular case studies. And the unifying theme is that these are applications that explore how Bayes nets can be used to explain how people reason about multiple causal systems. So in the first part, you could think of the multiple causal systems as different objects. So we have a mouse here, a rat here. Both of these are causal systems. Just think of the biochemical pathways in the systems of these two animals as complicated, rich causal systems. Second part of the talk, I'm going to move to counterfactual reasoning. So we're going to be thinking about cases where you have some knowledge about what this mouse does or what this mouse is like in the real world, and you're asked to reason about a counterfactual scenario involving the same mouse. Okay, so to get started with the first part, where we're thinking about multiple causal systems, multiple causal objects, you can formulate the problem that we're interested in as a matrix completion kind of problem. So imagine a setup where along the rows of the matrix here we have objects or systems. Along the columns here we have attributes of these objects. And it's a completion problem, so some of the cells in the matrix here are unknown, and we have to figure out what they might be. So there are lots of approaches to matrix completion, of course. The ones that are related most directly to what I'll discuss are approaches that focus either on what's known about relationships between features. So for example, if we knew something about causal relationships between features, we might be able to use that to fill in some of the gaps in the matrix. And there are also approaches that focus on what's known about relationships between objects. So for a biological example, if we had something like a phylogeny over the animals, we might be able to use that to make predictions about some of the missing entries in the matrix. The first application I'm going to tell you about is an attempt to combine both of these kinds of knowledge. So our goal is to come up with a prior distribution over entire matrices that's sensitive to both relationships between objects and relationships between features. For the empirical application of the work I'm going to talk about, we test our theories by trying to predict how people are going to respond to questions in the lab. And by necessity, the data sets are a little bit small because they're based on simple lab tasks. But just to give you a sense of how the same problems might be asked in settings that might be closer to the kind of things that some of you work on, imagine a case where we have phylogeny here over proteins, so we know something about the relationships between different proteins. And we have a graphical model here which tells us something about how the functions of proteins are related to one another. So Engelhardt and colleagues a few years ago came up with an approach that combined both of these kinds of knowledge for the purpose of protein function prediction, making predictions about the functions of novel proteins that hadn't been tested yet. So I think, despite the fact that I'm going to focus on small-scale examples, I think there might be some applications to bigger problems as well. So here's a small-scale example suggesting why I think humans have the capacity to reason about multiple kinds of knowledge simultaneously. So imagine there were 3 individuals, Tim, Tom, and Zach, and all 3 of them are smokers. So that's the first column in the matrix here. You know that smoking tends to cause lung cancer. That's our little causal structure up the top here. You also know that Tim and Tom are identical twins, and that Zach is just some other random guy here. Okay, so if I tell you that Tim has lung cancer, and now I say who's most likely to have to get lung cancer, Tom or Zach, I hope you share my intuition that you think Tom, the identical twin, is probably more likely to develop lung cancer. So the point here is that even though we have this causal relationship that applies to all 3 individuals, the fact that Tim and Tom are identical twins means that we think that the relationship between smoking and lung cancer is going to play out in similar ways for those 2 individuals. So one way to think about what's going on is like this. The relationship between smoking and lung cancer is really a complicated kind of thing that's mediated by all sorts of environmental and physiological variables. Because Tim and Tom are similar, we can expect that they're going to be similar with respect to these variables, and therefore we can expect that the outcome for Tom is going to match the outcome for Tim here. So I think inferences like this are intuitive. The question is, how do we capture those computationally? Okay, so the way we did it is by coming up with a way to combine 2 kinds of Bayes nets, a Bayes net over features and a Bayes net over objects. So the Bayes net over features that we're going to work with, these are standard Bayes nets. If you are working with just a Bayes net like this, it would give you a distribution over the rows of the matrix here. And if you wanted to, you could come up with a distribution on the entire matrix by assuming that all the rows are conditionally independent given the feature structure F. Here is a very simple causal structure capturing a probabilistic relationship between a cause and effect. So this is just a familiar graphical model. The CPD here is telling us how the effect here depends on the cause variable. This structure here is set up to capture a probabilistic kind of causal relationship. We're going to work with what are sometimes called functional causal models. Models where each effect variable here is a deterministic function of its causes. And to make that possible, you need to introduce additional random variables here that specify exactly how the probabilistic relationship up here is cashed out. So in this case, the causal link between cause C and effect E we're proposing is something that depends on 2 additional variables. There's a transmission variable which says, is the causal link from C to E active in this particular case? And there's a background variable B which says, well, maybe sometimes E is present just because of a background cause that has nothing to do with C in particular. And if you introduce these 2 variables and give them the right base rates, you can come up with this functional causal model here that induces the same joint distribution over C and E. So the 2 models here are equivalent in that sense. To help you navigate the diagrams, I'm going to show a standard notation is to use these double lines here for variables that are deterministic function of their parent. So you'll see that throughout. Okay, so the feature structures we're going to be working with are functional causal models like this. The object structures that we're going to be working with are tree-structured graphical models. So the approach here is to say, let's imagine that we have a tree like this over the objects. If we were using this in the standard way, we might say, okay, the columns here of the matrix are conditionally independent given the tree structure O here. And the way in which we set up this exact graphical model is the same way in which people typically do this in the literature, say, on Bayesian phylogenetics. We think of a simple process by which properties might be generated over the tree, and the CPDs in this Bayes net here are induced by that process. So the process in general you can think of in terms of a continuous time Markov chain operating over the tree. So imagine, for example, that we have a feature. We're imagining the feature being generated over the tree as we move from the root to the leaves. Suppose that at the root here, the feature, we start off sampling a value of absent for the feature. Then as we're spreading out over the tree, mutations can occur. I've represented them here by crosses. And so if we have 2 mutations in the position shown here, we're going to end up with the vector shown here as our set of observations over the 4 animals here. If we're looking at a feature with a base rate of 0.5, then the distribution for this node is going to be what's shown here. And the distributions, the CPDs for the remaining variables can be set up using the idea that the probability of a mutation occurring along a branch of length t is this quantity. If the base rate's something other than 0.5, there's a very similar relationship. I just focused on 0.5 because it makes it simple to put the equations here on the slide. Okay, so this is our graphical model for the objects. We had our graphical model here for the features. Now we're going to put them together to give us a distribution over the entire matrix. So the big win for us that follows from using a functional causal model here is that these 3 variables are now independent, which means we can use the idea that these 3 variables are generated independently over the tree. So we're going to use a combined graphical model where the first 3 columns corresponding to these variables are generated independently over the tree according to the object graphical model that we have. And then the final column of the matrix, which is the column for the effect variable, that's just going to be a deterministic function of the other columns in the matrix. So this combined graphical model is our proposal about how people might combine feature relationships and object relationships. And because it's just a graphical model like any other one, we can use standard techniques for inference. If we have observations for some of the variables but not the others, we can use standard inference techniques to make predictions about the missing ones. Okay, if I wanted to write down the equations for this, we want a distribution over the entire matrix M given the 2 structures. The distribution, this is factorized into the product of 4 terms, where the first 3 terms come from our blue object graphical model. That's the first 3 columns. And the final term here is something that comes from the feature structure. Okay, so this is our proposal. And like I said, we've evaluated by testing it on relatively small-scale experiments in the lab. So let me give you a sense of the kinds of experiments that we've looked at. So in one set of studies, we told people about a situation in which they were asked, they were told about a scenario in which they had to test 4 individual animals in the lab. There was a mouse, a rat, a squirrel, and a sheep. And we trained them on relationships between 3 features. So we said enzyme F1 tends to lead to the production of enzyme F2, which in turn tends to lead to the production of enzyme F3. And then we effectively gave people a matrix like this, where we gave them a handful of observations. So we said, for example, you know that the mouse has tested positive for enzyme F1. Can you tell us what all of these question marks are going to be? If you ask a psychologist about some predictions here, there are a few previous papers suggesting that if people are given causal knowledge, like this knowledge about relationships between features, then that knowledge tends to overwhelm or dominate any knowledge they might have about similarity relationships between the objects. So at least some psychologists would predict that people are just going to use this feature structure here and ignore this similarity information. So here's the title of a relevant paper, and you can tell just from the title what the conclusion is: when similarity and causality compete in category-based property generalization. We think that in a lot of cases, similarity and causality don't compete. We think that people draw on multiple kinds of knowledge but are able to flexibly integrate them as required. So our prediction is going to be that the feature structure here and the object similarity structure here are going to be combined in our experiment. Okay, so here are some results. So I'm showing you the 4 animals and inferences about the 3 features, F1, F2, F3. This column here has the little arrowhead because this is the piece of information that we told people. We said that the mouse has a feature 1 and they had to make predictions about the remaining columns. So you can see here, if you have a model that just uses the causal structure and assumes that the rows of the matrix are conditionally independent given the causal structure, that does okay, but it predicts that these three clumps of bars are going to be identical, and that's that's not too consistent with what we're seeing in the data here. If you use just the object structure, you do a little bit better, but not as well as you do if you combine the two kinds of structures according to the model that we proposed. So the qualitative result here in the data is that you see generalization across both the columns and the rows. The fact that the mouse has this feature leads people to infer that probably it has this feature and probably it has this feature. And the fact that the mouse has this feature leads people to infer that the rat is quite likely to have that same feature. And the sheep is maybe, squirrel and the sheep are maybe slightly above baseline, but not quite as likely as the rat to have the same feature. So we do see people generalizing along both dimensions. Yeah.
So what information about the rows do you give the similarity tree for rows, or is that nothing there?
So in this experiment, because we were using these familiar kinds of animals, we didn't provide people with any information about that. There's been subsequent work done by another group where they trained people on, they were actually greeble, so these little objects that they look a little bit like faces. And so the similarity in that case was something that was, the tree structure was something effectively given to people by the designer of the experiment. But for us, yeah, it's asymmetric. We have made up features and real animals. You can do these experiments with made up things along the rows and real features or vice versa.
Does your model learn that tree?
So the model doesn't learn this tree. There's kind of a possible extension of this work to structure learning. So for the results, for all the results I have today, we just assume that we have the two structures already, and the problem is how you combine them to make inferences about new features. But you're right, I think it'll be interesting to look at the implications for structure learning.
What is the actual correlation between the features? Before you said they were independent, but it doesn't.
No, so what we gave people English text suggesting that F1 tends to cause F2 and F2 tends to cause F3. And to support that, we gave people information. We gave them 20 cards showing for a random set of 20 animals what the values of these features were. So in those cards, typically if an animal had F1, it also had F2 and so on.
So the three features came together in the card?
Yeah, not all the time. The three features were consistent with a graphical model with probabilistic causal relationships. So another advantage of giving people the cards meant that the fits that I'm showing you didn't have to rely on free parameters. We could use the parameters that we use to generate the cards to sort of minimize the number of knobs we had to tweak when accounting for the data. Yeah.
How many replications did you how many test subjects did you ask?
So for the results that I'm showing you, I think it was on the order of 20 or 24. We did about 6 or 8 experiments like this in total. I only have the results here for one of them. Okay, as a second part of the same experiment, now we gave people one additional piece of information. We said, okay, the second test result comes back. You find that the rat has tested negative for feature 2 here. And so we were thinking that this case might be interesting because it sets up some conflicts for various cells in the matrix. If you think about this cell here, well, going by the causal feature structure, if the mouse has F1, probably you might think the mouse is going to have F2. But if the rat doesn't have feature 2, given that the rat and the mouse are similar, you might think, well, maybe the mouse is not going to have F2. So you're going to have to find some trade-off between those two kinds of inferences. So here are the data. Again, we find that the individual models in isolation are getting some things, but maybe not performing as well as we might hope. But if we put the two models together, we're able to do a little bit better here. And the results here are representative of what we were seeing across the full set of 6 or 8 experiments. People's inferences are captured to some extent by the individual models, but putting the two models together gives you a better account of what's going on.
Why do you think in this case the object correlation is lower than in the previous case?
So why do I think the object correlation is lower? So in this case, the model just based on the object structure alone is going to assume that the columns here are effectively independent. And so that means, say, the prediction about this entry here is going to be based only on the fact that the rat doesn't have feature 2. So, but people's inferences, if we look at the inference about this cell here, this is whether the mouse has feature 2. Well, so people are around 50 here. I guess one thing that the object model is getting wrong is under-predicting this particular entry. So I don't know if there's a single clear reason. It's just a combination of cases like this where the model is not taking an aspect of the situation into account that people seem to think about. Yeah?
And this resulted also in the previous ones. Why does the order of the features turn around between the mouse and the other ones in the feature model?
Oh, so yeah, that's a good question here. So this is as a consequence of the base rates the probabilistic information that we provided to people when we were explaining the feature structure. So we set things up to such that the reason that the base rate of feature 3 is higher than the base rate of feature 1 is because we used the same. We assumed that each feature here had some base rate of being there, just independent of anything else in the situation. Plus, feature 3 might be there because it's caused by feature 2. And so it's because of that you see this pattern here. Okay, so our approach is one way to combine graphical models. Of course, there are others. You might think about approaches where you compute the predictions of the two models and then you average them using some kind of weighted average. That would be a mixture of experts approach. It turns out that it doesn't work very well for our data. If you think of a product of experts approach where you say, we want to get a distribution over matrices, so let's do that by taking the distribution we get from the object structure and multiplying that distribution by what we get from the feature structure and renormalizing. So this would be the product of experts approach. This, for our experiments, does better than the individual models. Quantitatively, it does just a little bit worse than our combination model, but the differences aren't huge. So I think the reason why we prefer our approach as opposed to product of experts approach is that for our approach, you end up with a combined graphical model. And the structure of that graphical model allows you to think about questions like how people reason about interventions and how people reason about counterfactual. So this is going to be the second part of the talk here. For product of experts approach, what you end up with is just a distribution over matrices. You no longer have the graphical structure that you can use to ask about interventions and counterfactual reasoning and so on. So let me move to the second part of the talk where I'm going to talk a little about interventions and counterfactual reasoning and try to suggest why having a graph structure is useful for those kinds of problems. So the situation now is we're going to think about cases where I tell you something about this mouse here. Maybe I tell you this mouse has all three of the enzymes that we were thinking about in the previous experiment. And now I ask you to imagine a counterfactual scenario involving the mouse. I say, well, we know that the mouse actually has all three of those enzymes, but what if the mouse had tested negative for enzyme number 2? What would you predict about the other two? So again, the approach I'm going to talk about, we're going to evaluate at a small scale, but again, I think this is relevant to maybe bigger data kinds of problems that some machine learning researchers have worked on. So here is an example from a recent paper that talks about counterfactual reasoning. And the example in this paper has to do with ad placements, say, on a search engine. So if you're a company, you might have two choices. You can put your ad, you can pay for your ad to be placed here, which is a bit more expensive, or you can take the cheaper option and have it placed on the side here. Let's say you make a decision, you decide to place it here, you collect some data and you find how effective the ad is. Now, based on that data, you might ask a counterfactual question. You might say, if we decided to put the ad here instead of here, how much would our profit have gone up by? So it's a counterfactual question because you're asking about a situation that didn't actually occur. So examples like this, I think, suggest why counterfactual reasoning might be relevant to some of the things that machine learning researchers work on. Okay, to explain the approach that we're talking about, I'm going to focus on a much simpler example than ad placement. We're going to think about a communication network here where there are 3 transceivers. And in the real world, there are 3 transceivers. They're in this network such that the activation of A tends to lead B to activate, and the activation of B tends to lead C to activate. In the real world, you happen to know that all 3 of the transceivers are active. So that's what these little pictures here at the top indicate. Now I might ask you to think about a counterfactual scenario where the second transceiver here is not operating. And now I might say, what if the second transceiver had not been operating? Do you think that transceiver C would be operating? And do you think that transceiver A would be operating? So these are the problems we're going to look at. There's a long history in philosophy and psychology of people looking at these kinds of counterfactual reasoning problems. And here are just some of the people who've worked in this area. The approach that I'm going to talk about, Chris Lucas here is the first author on this approach. The approach can be seen as an application of the model that I used for the first part of the talk. Like that first part of the talk, we're going to assume that our causal knowledge about the three transceivers is captured by a functional causal model, where these variables with the double edges are deterministic functions of their parents. So here you might think that UA, UB, UC, they capture factors like environmental conditions that determine whether or not the link between transceivers are active, and so on. So we're going to have one network here for the real-world scenario. Then we're going to have a second network down here for the counterfactual scenario. So I'm going to use these prime variables to capture the idea that these variables correspond to what's going on in the real world, but are different because they belong to this counterfactual scenario. The fact that these two networks correspond to some extent, that this one's the real world version and this is the counterfactual version, we capture that by saying that these variables with the U's are often called exogenous variables because they're external to the system over the three variables that are of primary interest. So to capture the fact that these two systems ought to be related, we're going to say that the exogenous variables are coupled, and we're going to think of that coupling in terms of a simple kind of tree structure of the same kind that we applied to the previous example. So we're going to use the same math to set up the graphical model over this little part of the tree. Again, let's just say the base rate for one of these exogenous variables is 0.5. So we have a distribution of 0.5 at the root there. And the same notion that over any branch of the tree here, there might be a mutation. And the probability of that happening is a function of the length of the branch there. OK, so this is effectively the same model as before. We're just using it now to think about two systems where one is a real system and the other one is a counterfactual system. OK, in this context, it's interesting to think about two special cases of the model that we propose. So first, think about the case where this t variable, this captures the length of the branch from the root here to the variable. Think about the case where that t is infinitely long. So in that case, the probability of a mutation is going to be 1 on 2, or 1/2. What that means is that because the base rate is 1/2 as well, the fact that the branch is so long means that effectively knowing the value of one exogenous variable here tells you nothing about the counterfactual counterpart of that variable. So effectively, the two sets of exogenous variables are decoupled, and we might call this the unattached structural model. Unattached in the sense that what's going on for the real-world exogenous variables is uninformative about the values of those variables in the counterfactual scenario. OK, so that's one special case of the framework. Think now about the case where the length of this branch here goes to 0. In that case, the probability of mutation is going to be 0, and that makes sense because if the branch is very, very short, there's just not enough time there for a mutation to occur. What that means is that the two versions of the exogenous variable are going to effectively be the same thing. And you can represent that as a network where you just replace the two copies by one copy because the two have to be identical. And this special case of the model is equivalent to Pearl's proposal about how to reason about counterfactuals. So Pearl would call this a twin network, and our approach reduces to his in this special case here. OK, so let me now talk about two ways in which we can use these kinds of graphical models to reason about counterfactuals. So first, imagine a counterfactual formulated in terms of a counterfactual observation. So suppose I tell you again that transceivers A, B, and C are all active in the real world, and now I say, imagine that you had observed transceiver B to be inactive. What would you predict about transceiver A? What would you predict about transceiver C in that case? We deal with counterfactual observations in just the standard way that you would deal with any kind of inference problem over a Bayes net. So we say, in the real world, we know that the values of all these variables are 1. We're imagining having observed that this variable here in the counterfactual scenario is 0, and we can just propagate over the graph structure here to make inferences about the 2 question marks. Okay, so this is for counterfactual observations. If we're asked to think about a counterfactual intervention, the proposal is a little bit different. So now suppose, again, I tell you in the real world, A, B, and C are all active, and now I say, somebody hit transceiver B with a spanner, prevented it from operating in that way. Imagine if that had happened, what would you predict about A prime here and C prime here? So the intuition here is supposed to be, well, if somebody had intervened on this to disable it, then probably the status of A is going to be exactly the same. The fact that somebody hit B with a spanner, that's not going to change what determined the activity of A. So probably the activity of A is going to be the same. On the other hand, if you imagine observing that B were inactive, then maybe that provides reason to think that A was also inactive in the counterfactual scenario. Okay, so there is a difference between interventions and observations, and these directed kinds of graph structures are useful in part because they can capture that. So this is something that Pearl has emphasized in his work on causal reasoning. Okay, so the standard way to deal with an intervention, if we imagine reaching in and fixing the value of B prime here, then the way to capture that is to cut the links that go into B prime, because we're saying we're interfering with the normal causal mechanisms. We take out those arrows because those arrows are no longer determining the value of B, which is being set directly. And now we perform graph surgery. By cutting these arrows, we can perform standard probabilistic inference over the graph. We can say, okay, I know the values of all 3 variables are 1. I know the value of this variable is 0, and I can compute what follows over the graph. Okay, so the approach we have here to counterfactual reasoning can deal with both counterfactual observations and interventions. This is a distinctive feature of the account because if you think about the special case of our model where the distance t here is 0, if we're thinking about Pearl's approach, Pearl treats all counterfactual questions as questions about interventions. So for Pearl, that's the only sensible kind of counterfactual to ask. If we find that people are able to distinguish between counterfactual observations and counterfactual interventions, that suggests that Pearl's approach is not complete as an account of how people think about counterfactual situations. So let me show you some results from a study where we do ask about counterfactual observations and interventions. The story here made use of mice similar to the previous experiments I was telling you about. So the dotted arrows here indicate that people were told about a setup where there are probabilistic relationships between 3 hormones, A, B, and C. A tends to cause B, B tends to cause C. In the real world, you know that Frank the mouse, so a particular mouse, has all 3 of those hormones. Now I can ask you a question involving a counterfactual observation. I can say, for Frank the mouse, for this specific mouse, if you'd observed B to be absent, would A be present? And I can ask you a question about an intervention. I can say, for this specific mouse, if you'd raised him on special kibble that specifically prevents the formation of hormone B, do you think that hormone A would be present in that case? So let me show you the predictions. I'm going to call our approach here our structural model to distinguish it from Pearl's structural model. So the difference between these 2 cases here, in the intervention condition, let's think about that first. You know that in reality, Frank the mouse has hormone A. If you think about intervening to make sure that Frank doesn't have B in the counterfactual scenario, the fact that that was an intervention suggests that maybe the status of A is going to be left unchanged. And so people are giving relatively high responses to this question about A compared to their responses to the other cases here. in the observation condition, observing that Frank doesn't have B provides reason to think that maybe Frank doesn't have A either, because given this causal structure here, it would be a little bit weird if the animal had A but not B. So the prediction here is that the responses for A are going to be lower in the observation condition than the intervention condition. So our model is accounting for that. Pearl's model treats both cases here the same. It can't really distinguish between counterfactual observations and counterfactual interventions. The unattached structural model, this special case where the length of the tree branches goes to infinity, that predicts an effect in the right direction, but quantitatively the model is far away from the responses that people are giving. Okay, so this is one of the experiments that we've used to explore the kinds of model that I've discussed. We have a series of others. Let me just quickly tell you about one of them. So I won't go through the details of the setup here, but I can answer questions about that if you're interested afterwards. Let me just mention the key prediction here. We set up a case where our model predicts that the responses for A are going to be higher than the responses for C, but all the other models under consideration predict that the responses are going to be the same for those two variables, or that the response for C is going to be higher than the response for A. So we set this up to look at the idea that maybe our model isn't actually capturing what people are doing. Maybe a mixture model is the right way to think about it. So maybe people can either use Pearl's model or they can use the unattached model, and they just compute something which is a mixture between those two predictions. We have this experiment here set up such that no mixture of the competing models can explain the result that A is predicted to be higher than C. Okay, so these are giving you a flavor of two of the experiments here. Across our set of 6 experiments, here's a scatter plot combining all of the data, where we have the mean ratings of people on the x-axis and the model predictions on the y-axis. We're getting a decent account of the data. There are some detailed things in here that we're not getting right, but we're getting a decent account of the data, and we're able to do better than the other models that I've discussed. So mixture model is doing a decent job, but quantitatively not quite as good as the model that we proposed. Okay, so in this talk, I've been focusing on the notion that Bayes nets are useful in part because they help to reason about multiple causal systems, and we talked about 2 examples of this kind of idea. So I think what's critical here, the fact that you're reasoning about multiple causal systems means that it's important to keep the representations of those systems distinct. But the fact that they're related means that somehow you want to be able to tie together the parameters or different aspects of those causal systems. And I think that graphical models provide a transparent way for achieving those 2 goals. There are some natural ways to think about developing this work. So one of them came up already. I've been talking about inference only, assuming that we have the structures already. What if you're looking at problems where you need to learn the structures as well? Second direction that I think might be interesting is to look at cases where the multiple systems have graph structures that are similar but not identical. So maybe it's the case, for example, that the causal model for the mouse here and the causal model for the rat here don't have exactly the same topology. Maybe there are variables for the rat that just have no counterpart in the mouse, and so on. I don't know of a clean, elegant way to deal with that, but I think it's interesting to look at because people can certainly reason about cases where there are 2 systems that are related but not identical in their causal structures. Okay, so to conclude here are the suggestions I offered before about why Bayes nets might be useful for understanding how people think. I think the long-term goal that we'd be aiming for with this kind of work is to think about all the different kinds of knowledge that people have. Causal knowledge, similarity-based knowledge, knowledge about categories, and so on. Thinking about how all of that knowledge is combined and put together to support reasoning is a big, tough problem. I don't think that Bayes nets are going to provide the full solution, but I think they provide a useful place to start thinking about how a combination of knowledge works. Okay, I'd be glad to take any other questions. Yeah. Well, so there's,
You know what I'm saying?
let me try to answer. You can tell me whether it addresses the question or not. I think there's an interesting difference in how people think about what a counterfactual is. So for philosophers, for most philosophers, any kind of situation that goes beyond what we know about the real world is a counterfactual. And that includes cases where we're thinking about what's going to happen in the future. So I might say, you know, what would happen if I tripped over the chair on my way out? Do you think I would injure myself? Psychologists typically tend to use counterfactual more in a sense which might be called a retrospective counterfactual. So you're thinking about a situation that's actually happened. There's some ground truth about what the values of the variables are, and you're reasoning about a situation in which those variables take different values. And for psychologists, that's different because there you already have this representation of what happened. You need to maintain a different representation for this counterfactual scenario. For the future prediction idea, you can kind of take just a single existing model that you have and run it forward. You don't really need two copies of the model.
I see. So how can there be, so is the claim that there is, so if you're thinking retrospectively, the idea is that humans have intuitions about what the counterfactual would be, but there's absolutely no way to verify that.
So yeah, this is one of the reasons I think counterfactuals are psychologically so interesting, because there's no ground truth right answer. I mean, how could you ever establish a ground truth answer about a situation which didn't happen? But despite that, we have, in some cases, strong intuitions about how things should go. So in a lot of areas of psychology, it's interesting to think about models which are normative models in the sense that they tell you what people should do, and then you can compare them to models which try to capture what people actually do. It's interesting to think about whether there could be a normative model for counterfactual reasoning. My sense is that there couldn't be, just because there's no ground truth right answer, but others I think would make a different argument. Yeah.
So you close with this proposition that Bayes nets would be good for modeling some things, but maybe not for other things. I'm just curious if you have any intuitions around what those other things are, where you wouldn't want to use kind of the Bayes nets approach.
So I think that Bayes nets are essentially a propositional kind of representation. If you want to think about the knowledge that we have that you might express in natural language sentences using quantifiers like most or all or so on, then those, you can think of those maybe as pieces of knowledge that might be viewed as aspects of knowledge that can generate Bayes nets, but Bayes nets themselves aren't going to be the full part of the story. So I think that the kinds of things that people are trying to capture in representations like logic or representations where you maybe, if you think of the knowledge that people have as embedded in sort of a mini computer program as opposed to just a Bayes net, there are sort of richer representations that I think are interesting in some cases. So but the question is, if you're going to move towards those richer things, how do you sort of control the complexity of those possible representations and account for only the inferences that people are able to make? You know, how do you get the distinction between inferences that are natural for people to make and inferences that aren't so natural when you have this very, very powerful expressive system? So I think there's interesting work in this area, but it's kind of an open challenge to really know how you deal with quantification and these richer aspects of background knowledge. Yeah.
Thinking of the differences between intervention and observation, could you go back to the graph? Seems that your model cannot capture the effects on the last in the seed. I guess I think the results.
Oh, the results.
Models.
Yeah.
This one, yeah. So the last part of the seed, you know, that increase is not predicted by your model. And I wonder, well, first, what are the different, from the human perspective, what difference do you see between observation and intervention? And why would your model not capture that increase in the seed?
So I agree the inferences about C, our model is not getting, none of the models are getting, but I think that you see those increases. So for both the intervention condition and the observation condition, people are giving an answer for C that's higher than the model. The reason for that is I think people are assuming that hormone C might have some causes other than hormone B. In our simple little cover story, we told people that B was the only cause of hormone C. If people thought that there might be other causes of C, then giving an answer above 0 would be the right thing. So I think you're right. Our model's not getting that, but I don't see how that relates to the distinction between observation an intervention.
Right, it happens in both. So
Yeah.
what's interesting is why it wouldn't be higher for the intervention then, right? Given the instructions you just mentioned.
Okay, so the standard view of interventions would be that regardless of whether we're talking about an observation or an intervention here, the downstream consequences should be the same. Like regardless of how this variable came to be, then you don't sort of need to know how it came to be to figure out how that should influence the effect. So I think it's reasonable to think that observation and intervention conditions should give you the same inference here. Yeah.
So in your mutation probability, there's a parameter t, right?
Yeah.
So the results that you're showing, like, are you sweeping over all t's and like getting the one which is closest to the human model? Or?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So for the results we were just looking at, we were we were fitting that t as a free parameter. Here's a sensitivity analysis showing how the value, how the results depend on that parameter and comparing it to the mixture model. So here, black curve is showing how I think the y-axis is sum squared error over all of our experiments. I was showing the results for the best value of this t value, which is somewhere in the middle here. And so the result here is that the quality of the fit does depend on that parameter, but there's a range within which the model is doing better than the best possible performance you can achieve for the mixture model here. So for the first application that I talked about, there are ways to sort of objectively figure out what that t variable should be. Like you can fit data that people, you can ask people how similar is a mouse to a rat, and there are other questions like that, and you can fit the parameter. For the counterfactual application, it's this metaphysical sort of question. You can think about there being a split in the real world being on one branch of the tree and the counterfactual scenario being on another branch of the tree. But to talk about exactly how much time has elapsed between now and that splitting event, it gets you pretty quickly into the realm of these metaphysical questions where it's hard to know what the right normative answer should be. Yeah.
So when people don't fit your model, I could see that being because they're inferring on some different network, or maybe they're just failing to do inference correctly on the right network. Can you talk about like how you could tease apart those two types of errors?
So there are lots of different measures that you might think about as a way to evaluate an approach like this. I mean, imagine that somebody had a qualitatively different network. Imagine you had a follow-up task where they had to draw a little diagram showing how the variables related. Then you might figure out if, maybe one person thought that C caused B rather than the other way around. The idea that maybe they have the Bayesnet, but they are not doing inference right over the Bayesnet, there's actually some support for that. So you probably know Bayesnets make these strong predictions about screening off. So say for our little causal chain, if you know the value of B, then the value of C is independent of the value of A. There are cases in which people's inferences don't respect that, and there's some discussion about in the literature about why that happens. So yeah, certainly I think the strong claim that people's inferences are always in accord with Bayesnets, that's not right. But there are cases in which Bayesnets provide a useful framework for understanding what's going on. Okay, thanks.